In the summer of 1346, during the early years of the 100 Years' War, King Edward III of England led a daring invasion deep into French territory. He landed a small English army on the shores of Normandy and proceeded to burn and plunder a path through the countryside. Towns were sacked, villages set ablaze, and panic spread through France as Edward's forces marched boldly to within sight of Paris itself. King Philip VI of France, alarmed and outraged by the devastation, hurriedly gathered a massive army, perhaps around 30,000 men in total, nearly 3 times the size of Edward's force of about 10,000, and set out to chase down the English invaders. Philip was determined to corner Edward and crush him in a decisive battle. Edward realized he could not keep running from a force so large and so swift. He needed to choose the perfect place to make a stand. Somewhere his outnumbered army could negate the French numerical advantage. As he retreated northward with the French host in pursuit, Edward carefully scouted for favorable ground. In late August, he found exactly what he was looking for: a gently sloping hillside near the village of Crécy in northern France. The terrain here would give him an elevated position and a clear field of vision. It was there, on the rolling fields outside Crécy-en-Ponthieu, that Edward decided to stop and face his pursuers. He would not simply fight on French terms, he would set a trap for the unwary enemy. Edward III prepared his defences meticulously on the hillside. He arranged his troops in 3 divisions, or battles, and ordered most of his knights and men-at-arms to dismount. These armoured English warriors formed a solid defensive line of steel and shields near the top of the slope, bracing for impact. To protect their flanks and wreak havoc on the enemy from a distance, Edward positioned hundreds of archers wielding the longbow on the wings of his formation and slightly ahead of his main line. These were the famed English and Welsh longbowmen, highly skilled archers equipped with powerful 6-foot yew longbows. In Edward's plan, the longbowmen were the key element of the trap. They would rain death on the advancing French before the enemy could even get close to the English line. The English longbow at this time was arguably the most feared missile weapon in Europe. It took years of training and great strength to master, but in the hands of an expert archer, it could fire arrows at an incredible rate and range. A practiced longbowman might loose up to 10 arrows in a minute, and these arrows could travel 200 yards or more. The arrows were often tipped with bodkin points, narrow, hardened steel tips designed to punch through armor. Thousands of arrows launched in coordinated volleys could darken the sky and then punch down with deadly impact. Edward's archers were instructed to aim for the knights' horses and the less protected parts of enemy armor. Behind the archers, the dismounted knights and men-at-arms stood ready with swords, spears, and poleaxes to receive any enemy who managed to reach the line. Edward also took care to prepare the battlefield itself to hinder the famed French cavalry. According to some accounts, the English dug small hidden pits and trenches in the field at the base of the slope, then covered them with brush. An unsuspecting charging horse would stumble or break its leg in these holes. The recently ploughed fields, now slightly softened by recent rains, would be muddy and heavy going for armoured chargers. Some contemporary chronicles even mention that the English drove pointed wooden stakes into the ground in front of their positions, a tactic more definitively used in later battles, to further disrupt a cavalry charge. In short, the English made every possible preparation to break the momentum of any French attack. King Edward had chosen his ground wisely and fortified it cleverly. His trap was set. Meanwhile, the French army was closing in fast, moving relentlessly to force the English to battle. The French host was formidable. It included thousands of France's elite armoured knights and mounted nobles, the proud heavy cavalry that had dominated European battlefields for centuries. These knights, the elite cavalry of France, saw the confrontation as an opportunity to obliterate the upstart English once and for all. Alongside the knights were ranks of foot soldiers and a large contingent of Genoese crossbowmen. The crossbowmen were hired mercenaries from Genoa, Italy, equipped with powerful crossbows, weapons known for their strength and armor-piercing bolts, though slower to reload than longbows. Morale in the French camp was high. They vastly outnumbered the invaders and fully expected a swift victory once they could bring Edward's army to bay. By the afternoon of August 26, 1346, Edward and his men were in position on the hill near Crécy, anxiously awaiting the French onslaught. King Philip's forces began arriving on the scene, though not all at once. The French army had stretched itself thin in the furious chase. Many units were still straggling in from the south, tired from marching many miles that day. Some of Philip's advisors and senior knights urged the French king to pause for the night, assemble the full army, and allow the troops to rest before attacking. After all, an organized assault at dawn, with fresh troops, would have a greater chance of cracking the English defense. But Philip VI and many of his hot-blooded nobles were impatient. They feared the English might slip away if given the chance. By now they had caught Edward III in what looked like a corner of northern France, the Channel to his back and the French army in front, and they were eager to deliver a crushing blow immediately. Dismissing the calls to wait, Philip decided to attack without delay. According to legend, he ordered the unfurling of his royal battle banner, the oriflamme, a fiery red flag that signified no quarter would be given. Its message was unmistakable. The French intended to show no mercy and expected none in return. The battle was imminent. As the French vanguard drew near to the English positions, nature intervened briefly. Dark clouds gathered, and a sudden summer rainstorm swept over the fields of Crécy. Rain drenched the weary French troops and the ground alike. The English, however, were prepared even for the weather. On Edward's order, the longbowmen had de-strung their bows and tucked their bowstrings safely away to keep them from getting wet and slack. The men-at-arms covered their weapons and waited calmly as the rain fell. On the French side, the Genoese crossbowmen were caught in the downpour, with their heavy crossbows exposed. Many of these mercenaries did not have their large pavis shields with them at the front, the wooden shields used to shelter behind while reloading, so they simply endured the rain. Crucially, their crossbow strings became damp. A wet string loses tension, meaning when the crossbow is fired, the bolt flies with much less force and shorter range. This disadvantage would prove critical in the opening moments of the battle. After some time, the rain subsided. The late afternoon sun peeked through the clouds as the French made ready to attack. King Philip gave the order for the Genoese crossbowmen to open the battle and soften the English positions with a volley of bolts. Hundreds of Genoese mercenaries stepped forward, formed up in front of the French knights, and raised their crossbows toward the hill. They let loose a crackling volley of crossbow bolts, darkening the air with iron-tipped missiles. Normally, a mass of crossbowmen could be a terrifying force. Their bolts could pierce armor at close range, and the noise and sight of a volley might shake an enemy's nerve. But the Genoese were at a disadvantage. The English were stationed just beyond the effective range of the crossbows, especially now that many crossbow strings had been slackened by the rain. Thus, most of the Genoese bolts fell short or glanced off the English lines without effect. To make matters worse, the bright sun that emerged was now behind the English on the hill, shining into the eyes of the crossbowmen as they aimed uphill. The English line held firm with shields up, taking minimal casualties. Now, it was the English longbowmen's turn to respond. At the command of their officers, or perhaps simply taking their own initiative, the longbowmen stepped forward and drew their bows to the ear. A moment of silence hung in the air as hundreds of bowstrings went taut. Then came a command. "Loose!" With a collective twang, a swarm of arrows soared into the sky. The English archers were shooting at a rapid pace, each man sending arrow after arrow arcing high overhead. The sound of this was chilling, a hissing, whirring noise followed by the distant roar of arrows rushing down. In seconds, the Genoese crossbowmen found themselves under a darkening sky of incoming arrows. The longbow volleys descended with deadly accuracy into their ranks. Arrow after arrow plunged into the mercenaries. Quilted jacks and chainmail offered little protection against the bodkin point arrows raining down at high speed. Men screamed and dropped to the ground, clutching at suddenly pierced limbs and lethal wounds. Shields were few, and panic began to set in. Horses pulling the Genoese pavis carts were hit and reared up, adding to the chaos. In that opening exchange, the longbowmen demonstrated their superiority. They could shoot farther, faster, and with a higher volume than the crossbowmen. Within moments, the Genoese formation was faltering under the storm of arrows. Under this merciless hail of missiles, the Genoese lost all appetite for the fight. These men had marched and run for miles that day, and now found themselves being massacred from a distance by an enemy they could barely reach. Some of the crossbowmen managed one or two more disorderly volleys, but it was hopeless. They began to break and fall back, throwing down their crossbows in terror or frustration. Many turned and ran toward the safety of the French lines behind them, shouting, that it was impossible to advance. From the French perspective, this was a disaster unfolding at the very start of the battle. Their hired infantry was in full flight, and the path to the English was not even cleared yet. The reaction of the French knights to the fleeing crossbowmen was fury. These proud nobles considered the retreat a cowardly act that was spoiling the battle. As the defeated Genoese surged back toward the French lines, they disrupted the formations of the knights eager to charge. According to some chronicles, King Philip, enraged at the turn of events, shouted, "Kill me these cowardly rascals! They are blocking our way." In the heat of the moment, the French knights did turn on their own allies. A number of Genoese crossbowmen were cut down or trampled by the knights and horses as the French cavalry pushed forward. This cruel act illustrated the desperation and anger of the French commanders. They would rather cut through their own troops than allow the English a moment's respite. With the crossbowmen swept aside, the French heavy cavalry prepared to launch its grand charge. Trumpets blared and drums pounded as the signal to attack was given. The first division of French knights, led by prominent lords and nobles, lowered their lances. Hundreds of armoured horsemen spurred their massive war horses and began thundering across the field toward the English hill. They gathered speed, the ground shaking beneath the hammering of hooves. The knights were clad in steel plate and mail, shimmering in the waning daylight, and they carried the pride of French chivalry with them. This was meant to be the crushing blow. A full-force cavalry charge to ride down the upstart English archers and punch through the line of men-at-arms beyond. Edward's trap was about to be brutally tested. As the French knights charged up the gentle slope, the conditions of the field conspired against them. The earlier rain had turned parts of the ground into mud. The weight of the charging horses churned the soft earth, slowing their advance and breaking their once perfect alignment. Suddenly, horses in the front ranks began to stumble and fall. The hidden pits and trenches dug by the English were exacting their toll. A horse would plunge into a concealed hole and collapse, sending its armoured rider flying or tripping up other riders following close behind. What had been an impressive, unified charge quickly lost its cohesion, and all the while, the English longbowmen kept up their deadly work. Arrows poured down incessantly on the charging knights. The English archers had repositioned slightly to shoot at the flanks of the oncoming cavalry and into the thick of their ranks. They shot at will, each archer letting fly as quickly as he could notch an arrow and draw, resulting in a continuous stream of arrows streaking into the French. Knights began to fall from their saddles, screaming, as arrows found the gaps in their armour. Some knights took arrows in their horses. A wounded horse would collapse or rear wildly, throwing its rider and adding to the chaos in the French ranks. With horses falling and gaps opening, the momentum of the charge nearly ground to a halt before it even reached the English line. It was as if the French were trying to run through a hailstorm of steel. Nevertheless, some of the bravest and most determined French knights pressed on, reaching the top of the rise where the English infantry waited. By the time they made it, they were no longer a swift, thundering wave. They arrived in fragmented groups, exhausted and bloodied. There, they crashed into the wall of English men-at-arms. The English knights, who had chosen to fight on foot, stood firm with shields braced and weapons ready. The clash was ferocious. Disoriented French knights, many now on foot themselves, having lost their mounts, hacked away at the English line, trying to find a weakness. The English and Welsh infantry struck back with swords, axes and maces. A desperate hand-to-hand melee erupted, steel clanging on steel, fighters slipping on muddy, arrow-strewn ground. One chronicler described the close-quarters combat that day as murderous, without pity, cruel, and very horrible. In the midst of this brutal melee, the English Prince of Wales, young Prince Edward, later known as the Black Prince, was proving his valour. Just 16 years old, the prince had been given command of one of the English divisions, a bold move by King Edward III to let his son experience battle firsthand. Prince Edward fought at the front alongside his men, under the dragon banner of Wales and the royal standard of England. At one critical moment, the French cavalry onslaught nearly overwhelmed the prince's position. Some of the prince's retainers, worried for the heir's safety as they saw him pressed hard by French knights, begged King Edward, who was observing from a windmill on the hill, to send reinforcements to protect his son. King Edward's reply became legendary. Let the boy win his spurs. In other words, let him earn his honour in battle. and so the king held back his reserves. Prince Edward, despite the danger, refused to falter. He and his knights fought on fiercely, and with the help of the relentless archers and supporting infantry, they repelled the French who had broken through. By the time the first wave of French attackers finally recoiled and fell back down the slope, the young prince had indeed earned his spurs as a worthy knight. The first French charge had been utterly smashed. Bodies of men and horses littered the slope in front of the English. Yet the battle was far from over. The French were stunned by the initial repulse, but they were not ready to concede. Groups of French knights that had not yet charged, including fresh arrivals coming up to the battlefield, now organized themselves for another assault. It became a grim, repetitive pattern. Wave after wave of French cavalry formed and charged uphill, only to be met with the same devastating combination of obstacles, disciplined English infantry, and unceasing arrow fire. Some contemporary accounts suggest there were as many as 15 separate cavalry charges launched by the French that afternoon and evening. Each attack ended in bloody failure. The French knights showed tremendous courage, riding into the storm of arrows again and again, but courage alone could not overcome the clever tactics and advantageous position Edward had chosen. One legendary anecdote from the battle illustrates the doomed valor of the French allies that day. King John of Bohemia, an esteemed ally of King Philip, was present on the field with his retinue. King John was an older man, in his 50s, and nearly blind from a degenerative eye condition, yet he insisted on joining the fight to support France. As the French attacks ground on with mounting losses, John of Bohemia grew frustrated that he could not personally strike at the enemy. Determined to have a share in the combat despite his blindness, he ordered 2 of his knights to tie his horse's reins to theirs and lead him into the fray. In the midst of another charge, the blind king and his loyal companions galloped forward, plunging into the chaos of battle. It was an act of both bravery and desperation. John swung his sword and fought as best he could, but he and his small entourage were soon lost in the melee. The next day, after the battle was over, the bodies of King John and his 2 knights were found not far from the English lines. The 3 of them lay dead, still tethered together by the ropes that had bound their horses. The blind king's sacrifice was honoured even by the English. Prince Edward is said to have been so moved by John of Bohemia's courageous end that he adopted John's personal emblem, 3 white ostrich feathers, and the motto, Ich dien, I serve, as his own. This story became one of the enduring tragic tales of Crécy, symbolizing the feudal chivalry that met its match against new tactics that day. Back on the battlefield, charge after charge continued to be repelled. The sun sank lower toward the horizon as the fighting raged on. By now, the French were attacking in a disorganized fury, driven by pride and a refusal to accept defeat. The hillside was turning into a ghastly scene, countless arrows protruding from the ground and bodies, wounded horses screaming, knights lying in piles where they fell, and the once green grass churned into bloody mud. The English archers, who had initially been issued perhaps 60 to 70 arrows each, began to run low on ammunition after firing hundreds of thousands of arrows throughout the day. Some left their positions to scavenge arrows from the dead or pull spent arrows from the ground to reuse. Yet even as their arrow stocks dwindled, the damage was already done. The French assaults had been broken. In the smoke and din, even a new and frightening sound had joined the battle. The English had brought a few early cannon, also called ribaldi, and handgunners to Crécy. These were primitive guns, small crude cannons that fired stone or iron balls with a burst of gunpowder. During the battle, they boomed out across the field, startling men and horses with noise and adding to the confusion. This early use of gunpowder was not decisive in terms of casualties, but it was a harbinger of future warfare and must have further unnerved the French, who were unused to the sound of artillery. Every element of the English defence, from the clouds of arrows to the unyielding wall of men-at-arms and even the thunder of cannons, had combined to make the French efforts futile. As daylight faded into evening, the French attacks finally petered out. Many French knights had been unhorsed and could fight no more. Hundreds lay dead or wounded on the field, and the survivors were exhausted and demoralized. King Philip VI, who had been in the thick of the action trying to rally his men, suffered a minor wound. One chronicle says an arrow struck him in the jaw, and had seen at least 2 horses killed under him. Seeing that further charges would only lead to more slaughter, Philip reluctantly accepted that the battle was lost. In the gathering darkness, the French king and the remnants of his once mighty army retreated from the field. So great was the confusion and shock that the French did not even coordinate a proper withdrawal. Philip himself reportedly galloped away with a small escort, not stopping until he reached the safety of a castle many miles to the south. The oriflamme, that proud banner of no mercy, was nowhere to be seen. Its bearer had been slain, and the sacred flag had been captured by the English. When dawn broke the next morning, the scale of the French catastrophe became painfully clear. The English emerged from behind their defences to survey a field covered with the dead and dying. They were astonished at the victory they had achieved against such odds. By contemporary counts made after the battle, the French losses were staggering. The bodies of 1,500 or more French knights and nobles were found among the fallen, including some of the most illustrious names in France. In addition to King John of Bohemia, there were numerous princes, dukes, counts, and the flower of French chivalry lying dead at Crécy. Among them were Philip's brother, Charles II of Alençon, and Louis of Nevers, the Count of Flanders, as well as the King of Majorca and countless lords of lesser rank. The losses in the lower ranks, the ordinary French infantry and the Genoese crossbowmen, were harder to count, but certainly ran into the thousands. So many French nobles were killed that one historian noted it was the slaughter of the princes of France. In stark contrast, the English casualties were minimal. Chroniclers claimed that only a few dozen English knights and men-at-arms were killed, and perhaps a couple hundred infantry. Modern estimates suggest England's total losses might have been in the low hundreds at most, a mere fraction of the toll they inflicted on the enemy. It was, by medieval standards, an overwhelming victory for the underdog side. The outcome of the Battle of Crécy seemed almost miraculous to observers at the time. How could an army comprised largely of peasant bowmen and foot soldiers defeat the cream of French knighthood in open battle? In truth, it was not a miracle, but a combination of superior tactics, technology, and discipline that won the day for the English. King Edward's choice of terrain and his decision to have his troops fight defensively on high ground negated the advantage of the French cavalry's charge. The longbow, with its rapid rate of fire and long range, proved devastating when used en masse against charging troops. It was the medieval equivalent of a machine gun, cutting down waves of attackers before they could close. The English archers were not just well armed, they were also well trained and coordinated, able to maintain a withering rate of fire under pressure. The English men-at-arms fought on foot in tight formation, which prevented the French from scattering them, a tactic contrary to the traditional medieval ethos where knights typically fought on horseback, seeking individual glory. By staying unified and disciplined, the English heavy infantry could absorb and counter the blows of disorganized enemy horsemen. On the other side, the French made critical mistakes. Their eagerness to attack led them to charge piecemeal, rather than waiting to gather a cohesive force. Their reliance on an exhausted crossbow corps to open the battle backfired disastrously. Communication and hierarchy broke down in the frenzy to attack, whereas Edward III exercised calm leadership and control over his forces. In short, Crécy showed that a smaller army, if led wisely and armed with the right weapons, could annihilate a much larger force of traditional medieval warriors. Crécy's impact was felt far and wide. It was one of the first major battles of the 100 Years' War and set the tone for future clashes. The battle established the longbow as a dominant weapon on European battlefields and signaled the beginning of the end of the age of heavy cavalry's supremacy. No longer could armoured knights assume that battles would be decided by their gallant charges and individual combat. The tactics at Crécy proved that disciplined missile troops and common foot soldiers could decide the fate of an encounter. In the immediate aftermath, Edward III capitalized on his victory. With the French army in disarray, he marched north and laid siege to Calais, an important port city. Calais fell to the English in 1347, becoming a vital English stronghold on French soil for over 2 centuries. Crécy thus not only was a spectacular battlefield triumph, but also paved the way for further strategic gains in the war. The story of Crécy soon passed into legend. Across Europe, people spoke in astonishment of how an English army outnumbered, nearly 3 to 1, had managed to crush the French. The focus of many tales was on the English longbowmen, those humble foot soldiers who had brought low so many high-born knights. It was said that just a few hundred of these archers, 300 English longbowmen, as one popular telling exaggerated, had destroyed the proud elite cavalry of France. While the true numbers were larger, there is no doubt that the archers were the deciding factor. The Battle of Crécy, 1346, stands as one of history's great upsets and a turning point in medieval warfare. A small, well-led army armed with skill and ingenuity defeated a mighty feudal host. It was the day when the arrows of the English blotted out the sun and the chivalry of France was brought to its knees. In the annals of military history, Crécy remains a vivid example of an underdog victory. The day when 300 English longbowmen destroyed France's elite cavalry, rewriting the rules of war and etching a new chapter in the story of the Middle Ages.